Welcome to the first part of bullying with manipulative character assassination and its effects. Today we are talking about the breakdowns of aggressive behavior and the four main theories. This topic is very complex. With this topic, you really have to remember that bullying is not just a newfangled term, but an extreme form of violence that is still not taken seriously enough, and that begins or can begin at a very early age.
For example, in young adulthood, one can already experience various forms of exclusion very clearly. The fact that this form of exclusion is already bullying and represents a form of violence is something that few people know.
But before we go into detail, here are the breakdowns of aggressive behavior. Aggressive behavior is generally evaluated negatively. In addition, one must know that aggressive behavior is again one of our primary instincts and serves actually for self-protection. Health-wise regarded, that is actually also necessary in certain morally justifiable traits.
A typical example is mistreatment. If a person, no matter if child, woman or man, has to defend him or herself against mistreatment, aggression is essential for survival. Only through aggression, the person can succeed in defending him or herself somehow.
There are four main theories for the reasons of aggressive behavior. Theory 1. The biological model. In this model, aggression is assumed to be an innate behavior whose motivation comes from the evolution. For this reason, it is tried to influence the willingness to act out of aggressiveness. Theory 2. The learning psychology model. The learning psychology model states that aggressive behavior is not innate but is learned from behavior in early childhood, like from parental home, close family, friends, etc.
Example: a 3-year-old child experiences through his or her parents that aggressive behavior leads to success, so that they take them as role models and make demands in their age-appropriate way, in an aggressive way, like shouting and throwing on the floor in the supermarket.
Theory 3. Frustration-aggression model. This model is based on early childhood experiences of privation. For example, when determined and actually promising behavior is hindered from the outside, usually even by parents or older siblings themselves, which consequently causes frustration in the children.
Example: if a girl who is gifted in crafting is devalued by her father with the words, "This is not for girls, be quiet and go away, or you will be punished immediately," she must not use the father's tools, not even a screwdriver. Also, the desire for a crafting-related job is not tolerated in any way. Contrary to her talents and wishes, the girl is forced to choose another profession. This leads to frustration.
Theory 4. Biological drive theory according to Freud. Sigmund Freud assumed that aggressive behavior is based on a destructive drive, a mystical death drive, which he called biological drive theory. The inexplicable, therefore called mystical, will, as well as the desire to use violence and to experience its full satisfaction, even to enjoy it, generally known by sexual sex offenders.
There is an infinite number of true stories of suffering. You are able to see 2 examples of suffering in our continuing videos.
Welcome to the second part of bullying with manipulative character assassination and its effects. Today we are talking about the different categories of violence and how violence manifests itself. This topic is very complex because with this topic, again, you really have to remember that bullying is not just a newfangled term, but an extreme form of violence that is still not taken seriously enough, and that begins or can begin at a very early age. So let's start with the question, what is violence and how does it manifest itself?
Here we distinguish between 4 categories of violence: private violence, warlike violence, and terrorist violence, plus direct violence. In terms of private violence, we list points such as jealousy, domestic violence, disputes, insults, provocation, rape, blackmail, criminality, oppression, and also bullying. To the warlike violence, there are points like rebellions, wars and civil wars, homicides, prolonged war violence for political purposes. The motives range from religion and ideology up to enrichment to personal profit. Whereby wars are not exclusively waged by governments, these can also be rebels, warlords, or even drug barons. Terrorist violence includes points such as assassinations, non-governmental acts of violence like attacks on the innocent civilian population which have nothing to do with political wars, ruthless spreading of indiscriminate violence with fear and terror towards innocent people. Direct violence, whether physical or psychological, is generally visible. For example, in the form of disputes, rape, fisticuffs, insults, etc. Not to forget, also financial as well as mental exploitation belong to the direct violence.
Often perpetrators of violence suffer attacks in their childhood and at some point become perpetrators themselves, a vicious cycle from which the former victims themselves become perpetrators. The dangerous thing about this is that the perpetrators often do not let themselves be helped and thus harm other people, whether consciously or pathologically unconsciously, more and more because they consider their attitude as normal. In doing so, they appear very eloquent and convincing and supposedly self-confident. Over time, this enables them to influence not only unstable people, but also established personalities in such a way that they will sell them the pear as a banana. Welcome to the first example of the third part of bullying with manipulative character assassination and its effects. Today we are talking about true stories of suffering among students, which can be transferred symbolically to colleagues and acquaintances. We have selected an example from everyday life that unfortunately many people will know in this or that way, which we will share with you today. Names, data, and gender remain anonymous for privacy reasons. With this topic, you again really have to remember that bullying is not just a newfangled term, but an extreme form of violence that is still not taken seriously enough, and that begins or can begin at a very early age. There is an infinite number of true stories of suffering. If we take a young adult as an example, shortly before graduating from high school, very successful at school, known among the teachers as a responsible student, can suffer extremely under the schoolmates despite his or her academic peak performance and loyalty. Why could a successful person who successfully attended high school suffer? This question pipes up at this point, right? It is completely simple, but the reasons various. The young adult comes possibly from bad or simply poor parents' house, lives in a remote village in that the public connections home are not particularly good. The student could have seriously ill parents or has even a handicap, is perhaps even an orphan or care child, cannot carry perhaps the most expensive clothes and does not get the driver's license as well as the car for the 18th birthday. Additionally, the student is not flexible enough for her or his schoolmates, even to strangers, but nobody ever gets the idea to say that they would like to have him or her with them on their trips and drive the student home. Not even classmates from the same village offer to drive their classmate home. Instead, they accuse their classmate of being too strenuous, inflexible, and under the wings of their parents. After all, he or she is over 18 and the others are allowed to do what they want. They don't have to put up with anything from their parents anymore and are allowed to go wherever they want. 18-year-old boys and girls, who in their perception really believe to have saved the world and act as heroes, question and even insult the educational methods and family rules not only of their parents and family with a shameless and disrespectful impudence. This intolerant impudence alone is a clear sign of ignorance. They simply know nothing about life. Their exaggerated appearance is merely confident appearance with complete ignorance. The most unfounded and brainless accusations are told. And all of this without questioning. They know nothing about this young person, absolutely nothing. They see what they want to see and interpret everything in black and white. Narrow-minded, manipulative, and disrespectful and absolutely intolerant. The young person is sharply excluded, ignored, and badly portrayed by others. Without once having a reasonable conversation with the person, the student is condemned by its classmates for things he or she can't even change. In fact, there are no such problems, and the exaggerated accusations are complete nonsense. It turned out that this young person had only one single parent who was once the CEO of a giant international company and unfortunately fell so seriously ill that he or she was unable to work. Of course, the parent does not like the situation at all. Which child can help it if the parents get divorced or seriously ill and unfortunately can no longer offer their child everything? A single father or mother who is possibly seriously ill must now calculate their household differently than other healthy working parents. That is a fact and nothing new. To punish the child or any child for these conditions is only a sign of selfishness, intolerance, and social incompetence. These people are only interested in themselves and not in other people. Other people are only used in order to achieve the bullier's goals. So as soon as the goal is fulfilled, they are kicked away mercilessly, also known as elbow people. But the student doesn't say anything. The student is silent, but regularly hears how the others plan their events and later talk about them in an amused way. The student remains silent. He or she is being ignored, feels isolated, and is always deeply disappointed that no one of them looks closer and asks questions just once. Not one person. No one. And yet, despite the serious illness, the young person has enjoyed a great upbringing and has grown into an open-minded, cheerful, helpful, and culture-loving young person. Unfortunately, the parent can no longer make big financial purchases, so the parent can no longer offer their child different things at once, but only one thing at a time. But this does not bother the child because basically there's nothing missing. The only thing which is still hindering the young person as a problem is that the student just has to watch how he or she comes back home. Nothing more, and only into this one thing a bunch of crap is interpreted, up to the manipulative damage of reputation. There is an infinite number of true stories of suffering. You are able to see 2 examples of suffering in our videos. Welcome to the second example of the third part of bullying with manipulative character assassination and its effects. Today we are talking about true stories of suffering among neighbors, which can be transferred symbolically to colleagues and acquaintances.
We have selected a neighborhood example from everyday life that unfortunately many people will know in this or that way, which we will share with you today. Names, data, and gender remain anonymous for privacy reasons. With this topic, you again really have to remember that bullying is not just a newfangled term, but an extreme form of violence that is still not taken seriously enough and that begins or can begin at a very early age. Neighborhood example. Who doesn't know this? Neighborhood disputes that usually arise only from misunderstandings. Why do misunderstandings arise at all? Because people do not talk to each other. Emphasis on to each other, because if only one is willing to talk and the other one blocks, it doesn't work. Both have to be able to listen and to communicate respectfully with each other. Example: how a family neighborhood was infected with aggressively manipulative bullying. The events taking place under or between the neighborhoods are typical combinations of various forms of violence. In this neighborhood example, all residents left the doors and locks of their cellars and laundry rooms unlocked for about 40 years. One could leave parcel packages in the stairwell. Apartment doors could be left open, and the residents even left their keys outside so that the other neighbors could have access if anything happened. For about 40 years, nothing had changed. There was peace, and the residents appreciated that very much. And if there was something to talk about, they talked to each other or wrote a note to inform the others. But suddenly, everything changed. These new neighbors came into the house, were also warmly welcomed, but that didn't last long. The aggressiveness of the new family became clear very soon, but nobody knew yet how their aggression would look like and that they were on the lookout for new victims. After a thorough investigation, it turned out that the new neighbors were terminated from their previous apartment for these reasons, among others. Apparently, there had been such incidents before. These new neighbors broke over 40 years of existing rules down. They shamelessly exploited the trusting relationship of the residents and began, for example, to serve themselves unscrupulously from the cellars and laundry rooms of the other residents, and also packages disappeared at once in an inexplicable way. In addition, they smoked in the staircase, cellar and laundry room area, which is logically available for the general public and accordingly must not be smoked in, until one day they made a mistake that they could not deny. At first, nobody noticed anything. For the long-time residents, these were strange coincidences which they could not explain themselves, since they did not know such problems in the house before. Until one day, one of the longtime neighbors told the other that the new residents were taking things of the others away. Since no one could explain this, they let the landlords know by electronic message that there are strange things going on that could not be explained, and only asked if they knew anything or if there was something new that was perhaps not yet announced. About 1 month passed until the landlords then talked to a renting party, since they wanted to know who the troublemakers are. And although the matter itself in the will of peace had checked off, one had to tell the landlord the truth, of course. Logically a dilemma for the person who now had to answer the question, but the person decided to stick to the truth as always. So the person said, by the way, who it was, but also mentioned clearly that the case was chopped off in the will of peace, and therefore nobody said anything anymore. The poor person could not suspect, unfortunately, that the landlords would nevertheless still hook with the new ones and instruct them. This had the consequence that the questioned person was insulted now as deceitful. The reason for bullying and character assassination was born. The person who stands for the truth has now become a victim. The new ones, the perpetrators, started since that day a manipulative reputation murder and bullying. With their distorted and factually wrong perception, the perpetrator set up now lies like, the person, the victim, has explicitly made a written complaint to the landlord because of them. So the newcomers, the perpetrators, use the possibility of the truth distortion around others with their distorted perception and lie machinery to manipulate. They widely interpret all sorts of things into it and make plans to mob this person, the victim, subliminally and at the same time openly out of the house. It runs in such a way that the perpetrators, together with their infected and manipulated persons who have brought them into their abode, make alleged plans and announce them loudly so that the victim can hear it in any case. The perpetrators stand in front of the open window to announce what would happen next, or catch other people in the stairwell or on the street to infect them as well with their manipulation. The unjustly accused victim decided to intervene and stood up in front of the perpetrator group and politely addressed the perpetrators and accomplices. They should not harass others and clarify this directly with each other. The perpetrator became loud, insulting, and pejorative. That is a typical perpetrator behavior. They cannot stand silent. They need an action. If a victim doesn't take their level, perpetrators are confused, which is why they scream, since they cannot handle such a situation. And so the perpetrator yelled at the victim with unsustained arbitrary accusations. But the victim is clever and does not get involved to this level, so that the perpetrator broke out of the situation insulted and widely raging. Subsequently, such confrontations between the perpetrators and other parties followed. Subliminal bullying always takes place directly between the perpetrator and the victim. The perpetrator takes great care that no witnesses are present during such attacks. Then things can happen like that in encounters sounds of disgust are made, like repeated ooh, ugh. Or the faces are distorted, or at rest times doorbell is rung wildly and people run away. Garbage and objects are thrown on the balcony, dog poop or cigarette butts are placed in front of the house entrance, newspapers are torn out of the mailbox and thrown on the floor, etc. Some will think now, what? Totally childish and unimaginative, right? And you are right, but that's the way this kind of perpetrator ticks. In this time, also packages disappeared, those postmen of many years put in the stairwell without the packages being lost afterwards. The offenders do not recognize that they do not only let the packages of the neighbors disappear, but also bring the postman into extreme difficulties. Because also the postman had built up confidence to this house for about 20 years and signed the receipts of the packages himself, if the neighbors were not present. This example shows that offenders are not able to think further and estimate the consequences because they are completely occupied with themselves and stuck in their own perception. And here we are again at the same topic as before. It is not being asked. The person was not even asked by the other longtime neighbors who boarded their manipulative boat if what the perpetrator said was true. Nobody had the idea to ask or to say that it seemed strange to them and that they could not even imagine it. Instead, all get on the bullying boat and practice communally uninhibited character assassination. It is frightening to see how a single person, the perpetrator, can be so manipulative that others don't even think to question the statement without providing any evidence at all. After 40 years of time together in the house, one should be able to expect that such suspicious allegations simply cannot be true. But all assume that one person, the perpetrator, in their exaggerated delusion or in their self-torn perception, speaks the truth. Normal would be to hear both sides and then form an opinion. And since that does not happen, one recognizes the manipulative procedure. But unfortunately, also in the society, far too often one looks away, like also here, or the dangers of bullying are not recognized at all. Also, one cannot prevent or really prove bullying because of the subliminal unpredictability. Bullying always runs off subliminally. Spectators have usually turned away from the victim and would prefer not to have anything to do with the matter. After all, they could then become victims themselves, but they still listen. But this exclusion and the silence of the audience does not free them from their guilt.
Welcome to the fourth part of bullying with manipulative character assassination and its effects. Today we are talking about why is this so and how can you help. Since this topic is very complex, some points from the last videos will be repeated.
We know, we repeat this, but it is very important. Because with this topic again, you really have to remember that bullying is not just a newfangled term, but an extreme form of violence that is still not taken seriously enough and that begins or can begin at a very early age.
The events taking place between the students or neighborhoods are typical combinations of various forms of violence.
It must be assumed that these persons who now act as perpetrators themselves became victims of violence in their childhood, which causes frustration today if they cannot exercise violence in any form by themselves.
They have never known charity, so that friendliness, loyalty, and genuine charity have remained foreign words to them.
Of course, they know these words, but they frighten them and bring uncertainty out of this fear and insecurity. They arbitrarily choose victims to manipulatively strengthen their inner restlessness and the necessary sense of belonging. They have never learned it any other way. They manipulate people to strengthen themselves, they continue what they already know. And that is violence in whatever form.
Eloquent, excessive, or even exaggerated self-confidence and reality distorted as well as overly exaggerated portrayal of oneself or a thing, which are accompanied by an arbitrary frightening aloofness.
But why is this so?
As we know now, perpetrators are usually victims of violence themselves or are currently suffering it.
But no one should see how weak or vulnerable they really are. No one should recognize what kind of suffering they are going through. The collapse of the protective wall would mean complete exposure. And in order not to endanger this aloofness and to protect their distorted perception, they often choose the wrong way and become perpetrators themselves.
They are perceived as crazy and unpredictable, sometimes even as thugs.
Therefore, for people who deal with them on a daily basis, the best thing is to keep as they are and to dare to stand up to them. Because exactly with these first thoughts, I make myself invisible so that he or she does not pick me out, is the beginning of a bullying victim role.
Bullying perpetrators pick out the most bizarre things to keep the victims small. Religion, ancestry, skin color are the keywords. But often they are banal things like good grades in school, poverty and exclusion from society, diseases and disabilities, stuttering, wearing glasses, big ears, crooked teeth, braces. The list could go on forever.
And such a banal thing is what these exemplary disputes are about, whereby one cannot call it a dispute since one side is fully acting out of the perpetrator role.
The perpetrators proceed very mercilessly and do not always stick to verbal attacks.
Far too often, physical violence is also used. This combination of physical and psychological violence can burden and internally destroy victims to such an extent that they even take their own lives.
Subliminal bullying always takes place directly between the perpetrator and the victim.
It is frightening to see how a single person, the perpetrator, can be so manipulative that others don't even think to question a perpetrator's statement without providing any evidence at all. One should be able to expect that suspicious allegations simply cannot be true. But all assume that one person, the perpetrator, in their exaggerated delusion or in their torn self-perception or representation, speaks the truth.
Normal would be to hear both sides and then form an opinion. And since that does not happen, one recognizes the manipulative procedure.
But unfortunately, also in society, far too often one looks away, just like in the examples given in our last videos. Or the dangers of bullying are not recognized at all. Also, one cannot prevent or really prove bullying because of the subliminal unpredictability. Bullying always runs off subliminally.
Spectators have usually turned away from the victim and would prefer not to have anything to do with the matter. After all, they could then become victims themselves, but they still listen. But this exclusion and the silence of the audience does not free them from their guilt.
In conclusion, perpetrators are perceived as crazy and unpredictable, sometimes even as thugs. You don't really want to have anything to do with them and want to avoid them because due to their unpredictability and their loud, strange behavior, you never know when or why they will choose you as the next victim. One can behave still so inconspicuously, but for the offenders there are enough reasons to attack the victim arbitrarily.
There is an infinite number of true stories of suffering. You're able to see more about bullying in our last videos.